We've been doing this series for 4 years now, and it's a series of books that were originally chosen by the Library of Congress. They chose 88, and they left 12 spaces free out of the 100 for people to nominate other books. But they chose them not because they're the best books, not because they were prize-winning, because they won all the awards. They chose them because they started conversations. We used them to argue with each other. We used them to dream dreams. We use them to raise babies, if you think about Dr. Spock and Goodnight Moon. And we use them in our everyday life to cook and to do other things. So today's edition is going to deal with the joy of cooking. And we're happy to have all of you here today. Each of these conversations has been led by an AU faculty member or somebody important to the university. An alum has done some of these for us as well. So we're really happy that you are able to join us, because we like the idea that frequently our faculty members put this in a different context than I would if I were looking up a recipe in this particular book. So she's going to give us a bigger context than just our kitchen. Our speaker today is Stephanie Hartman. She's the Adjunct Professorial Lecturer in the Department of Literature, who's going to discuss The Joy of Cooking by Irma Rombauer and Marion Rombauer Becker. Dr. Hartman teaches the American Studies course, Food, Media, and Culture. And she's going to talk about this book's significance and the evolution of recipes, cookbooks, and food blogs. She teaches courses in media studies and food studies, and is interested in how cookbooks relate to other genres and how we can read them. She has a PhD in English from Rutgers University, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this podium.
Thank you so much. Hi, welcome. I'm so grateful to you all for coming. And unfortunately, the food blog part of the talk ended up dropping out, but feel free to ask me during the discussion, the conversation at the end. And we can, if you have any interest in that, we can definitely fit it in at that time. So the joy of cooking. Most people know the joy of cooking as the worn book with the cracked binding that's a fixture of so many kitchens. And I learned recently that it never shows up at used bookstores because everyone uses up their copy. They never give it away. But they may not thought of it as important in the sense that the Library of Congress did when they put it on their list of 100 books that shaped America. A cookbook might seem out of place in the company of such obviously influential books as the Federalist Papers, Uncle Tom's Cabin, and Silent Spring. But this book, this is what the very first edition looked like, which probably doesn't look like one you may have remembered from your kitchen. But this book, which has sold more than 18 million copies and never been out of print, represents the closest thing we have to an American cuisine. It serves as a standard reference for millions of people when they want to cook an apple pie, fry some chicken, or bake a cake. Or for that matter, make sauerbraten, tamale pie, oysters Rockefeller, or beaver tail, because America is a big place. Its 8 editions reflect shifts in popular taste over the last 80 years, but I'll be focusing on the first 2 in the 30s, which catch American eating habits in the act of modernizing to incorporate both convenience foods and more foreign and regional foods. But a cookbook is more than its recipes. And what made the joy of cooking indispensable to generations of cooks was not just the clarity and reliability of its recipes, important as these are, but its authorial voice, the droll, unpretentious, breezy presence of Irma Rombauer. This voice differentiates it from cookbooks like Better Homes and Gardens and the Betty Crocker cookbook, which were written by committee, by the domestic science departments of corporations. Joy is a family affair. Rombauer first self-published her cookbook in 1931. The first trade edition, commercially published edition, was 1936. And after her death in 1962, the project was taken over by her daughter, Marion, then Marion's son, Ethan Becker, and his wife, and now their son, John. Many readers have described the book as a good friend in the kitchen. And when cooking is most often done alone, and at least some of the time, you probably don't know what you're doing, feeling like you have some companionship can be a lifeline. So the success of The Joy of Cooking raises numerous questions. What role do cookbooks serve? How are they perhaps more like other books, memoirs, travel narratives, novels, history books than we might think? What does it mean to read a cookbook like a rare novel, as Sylvia Plath wrote that she did with The Joy of Cooking? And what can this most American of cookbooks tell us about who we are as Americans? To understand The Joy of Cooking's place in history, it's useful to take a quick look at what came before. So let me, there. So while there's a tendency to suggest that cooking knowledge was lost just a generation or two ago, the history of cookbooks suggests that, in fact, every generation has needed help. Amelia Simmons' 1793 cookbook was the first cookbook to be published on American soil, and it's also on the Library of Congress's list of 100 books that shaped America. Its recipes include both familiar British foods, including grilled meats and game, pies and puddings, but with New World ingredients such as cranberries, pumpkin, molasses, and cornmeal. And like The Joy of Cooking, it was also self-published. According to the Feeding American Cookbook Project at Michigan State University, its importance cannot be overestimated. They call it another Declaration of Independence, perhaps because if America has its own cookery, then it must be its own nation. If it has a national cuisine, then it's not just an offshoot of England. The Joy of Cooking was likewise a time capsule of American food at a moment of transition, with a uniquely American array of recipes that represent past tradition, often adapted to newly available ingredients. For Rombauer, however, the new ingredients were not cornmeal and pumpkin, but condensed soup, canned vegetables, and bottled condiments and Italian spaghetti. American supermarkets were just beginning, and they were making a range of convenience and non-local foods available to families. The Frugal Housewife, a little later, by Lydia Marie Child, promotes the virtue of economy in the tradition of founding cheapskate Ben Franklin. It contains practical information on home remedies and explains how to scour a stove, raise children, make soap, and save money. Cooking is just one aspect among many of domestic work. It's also an advice or self-help book on how to be a neat, virtuous, cheerful, industrious, and respectable woman. Child says, it is the character of true economy to be as comfortable and genteel with little as others can be with much. This slim volume, and it went through many, many editions, accompanied many families in their covered wagons as they went west, and for many people it might have been the only book that they owned besides the Bible. And it helps them not only to be resourceful and stretch provisions, which is an important survival skill, but also to feel like they were still civilized people, even on the frontier. The Depression-era Joy of Cooking also embraces thrift, and it includes recipes for serving a small piece of leftover meat attractively, making an economy souffle out of leftovers, and eating nose to tail, using cheaper cuts such as heart, kidneys, brains, and tongue. It also includes foods like beef tenderloin, perhaps to dream about enjoying in better times. And while Rombauer isn't moralizing or prescriptive, and she also doesn't assume the reader is a housewife, her cheerful, informal tone and insistence that cooking can be a joy is a way to put a brave face on economy and take pride in your own ingenuity. And you can imagine a cookbook as a kind of a guide to savoir-vivre, an attitude toward life's pleasures, but also, at times like this, also its hardships. At the turn of the 20th century, Fannie Merritt Farmer's Boston Cooking School Cookbook, which is still in print as the Fannie Farmer Cookbook, popularized scientific cookery in America, meaning that it advocated precise measurements and exact instructions to make cooking more like a science. Its recipes reflect the latest in nutritional science, which made taste secondary to digestibility and calorie density. You were not necessarily supposed to enjoy food, only insofar as it made you eat the right foods that your body meant, but the other pleasure part was completely superfluous. This rather stern cookbook was the ruling cookbook for decades. It introduced the recipe format we see today, starting with a list of ingredients instead of a paragraph. So if you look at these pumpkin pie recipes from the first two older cookbooks, and I picked pumpkin pie because Thanksgiving is coming up because pumpkin is American, you can see that they're paragraphs, and these are actually unusually long for cookbooks of this time. Often a recipe would only be a very short paragraph, and they would assume that you know how to do the basic things that are being described. So here it assumes that you know how to stew your pumpkin, and that you add, you sweeten to taste, you add molasses and sugar to taste, spices to taste. The spoonfuls are literally the spoons that you would have in your cabinet. So you'd have a small spoon, you'd have a larger spoon, you might have a teacup. A recipe might call for an egg-sized piece of butter. You know, there aren't measuring cups and spoons at that time, and you're expected to know how to do basic things. So these are just kind of reminders and guidelines for the most part. And people would learn how to cook by the side of someone who did know how to cook. You wouldn't actually be learning how to cook from a book. But the Boston Cooking School Cookbook doesn't assume that you know anything. They're going to tell you what you need to know. And you can see here that the measurements are very specific. There are standard measuring cups and measuring spoons. The amount of spices are exact. A quarter teaspoon is the right amount of those spices. And then it's by setting the ingredients up above, it makes it very clear so you can get your ingredients in order before you make your recipe. So often the cookbooks, once you start spelling out the instructions more, the recipes are longer. In this particular case, they don't happen to be. So learning, so you can see how this format is made to be very clear to someone who doesn't know how to cook and to really spell things out. So learning how to cook American foods by American methods was considered essential for immigrants to assimilate. When the Boston Cooking School Cookbook instructed cooks to make boiled vegetables with white sauce and serve dainty and tidy-looking foods, they were asking immigrants to leave behind the garlic-infused one-pot meals from their own tastier culinary traditions. This was all in the name of science, but the effect was nonetheless political. Cookbooks were in effect how-to manuals in how to become American. The other influential cookbook when Joy was published was this, The Settlement Cookbook by Lizzie Candor, which was created to teach Jewish and Italian immigrants American ideas of nutrition and hygiene. So part of the audience for this book was the immigrants themselves, but it also found a much wider audience in the general population, and they sold a lot of copies of it. It was also a fundraising cookbook because it was a good, clear cookbook with lots of useful recipes. And that way it funded a lot of the settlement projects, which included teaching English and vocational skills. And the settlement was in Milwaukee. It was founded by Jewish German Americans. And it was, like many others during the Progressive Era, modeled on Jane Addams's Hull House in Chicago. And this cookbook also included traditional Jewish and Eastern European recipes, so it showed an understanding of food's cultural importance to immigrants and to people in general in a way that the Boston Cooking School Cookbook did not acknowledge at all. And it suggested that you could bring your food traditions here and still be a good American. Now, Irma Rombauer had connections to European traditions that were part of her identity and that she included in her cookbook. She had no cooking school or settlement project behind her. She just knew what she liked. And here's the book, and this is there's a facsimile edition published too. So you can actually, this is in print, you can still buy it should you want to. And the book's cover shows Saint Martha of Bethany, the patron saint of cookbooks, defeating a dragon, and this very kind of modernist Art Deco lettering. So it really strikes a more kind of, a proud attitude than the Boston Cooking School Cookbook, which is much more technical. And she's also relying on myth rather than science for the empowerment of the readers. Rombauer was from a prominent family in the flourishing German-American community of St. Louis. After the suicide of her chronically depressed husband in 1930, she decided to take a page from fundraising community cookbooks and raise some money for herself. She spent $3,000, half the money left to her by her husband, to self-publish a cookbook, drawing from family recipes as well as one solicited from friends and neighbors. So this cookbook actually has elements of two different kinds of cookbooks. One of them is the manuscript recipe book, which is a collection of recipes handed down within a family, and that often favors the baked goods that you might make just around the holidays, because those you're not necessarily going to remember exactly how to make year to year. And often it doesn't include a lot of regular dinner recipes, because those you make regularly enough that you remember how to do them. And it also has elements of a community cookbook, because it takes recipes from her community that were contributed by her neighbors and by people who she knew, and it brought them all together. It does not attribute those to any of her neighbors by name, but it sort of represents the community through the inclusion of those recipes that were not from her own family. One neighbor, upon learning that Rombauer was collecting recipes for a cookbook, protested, "But Irma, everyone already has those recipes." But that didn't prove to be a problem. While Rombauer was well known as a hostess, her greatest strengths were social rather than culinary. In fact, upon hearing that she planned to publish a cookbook, her brother's household response was, "Worst idea ever. Rombauer, Irma is a terrible cook." She was better known for decorating cakes, which she took a course in, but she was really known for being able to throw together a meal out of nothing. So she could, go to your pantry and make that into dinner quickly and with flair. So one might wonder how Rombauer's seemingly unpromising amateur project went on to sell 60 million copies in her lifetime, now 18 million and counting. One reason is that it served a need. During the Great Depression, many houses had to scale back or give up hired help, a trend which had already begun in the mid-19th century and then accelerated further during World War II. As domestic employment was poorly paid menial labor for women on the lowest rungs of society, no doubt their former employers were not thrilled to be taking it on themselves and were probably skeptical of the idea that this work could be considered a joy. Yet in The Joy of Cooking, Rombauer insists that cooking can be done with finesse, good humor, creativity, and even for pleasure. Because Rombauer was not particularly domestic, she would rather be running a committee or actually enjoying the company at her dinner party. Her approach to cooking was pragmatic and time-conscious. She didn't pressure readers to be domestic goddesses. She was fond of canned soups and bottled helpers like savita to add flavor to gravies. She favored foods that involved more construction than cooking, like canned cherries stuffed with hazelnuts or making a salad out of cottage cheese and grapes with French dressing. Salad seldom means green salad during this period. And she recommends soufflés as a way to impress with minimal effort, as they are a simple and useful everyday dish that is held in awe by many who entertain an exaggerated idea of its difficulty. Maybe not being a great cook herself gave her insight into what every woman needed in a practical guide. As she describes in her preface, "I have attempted to make palatable dishes with simple means and to lift everyday cooking out of the commonplace. In spite of the fact that the book is compiled with one eye on the family purse and the other on the bathroom scale, there are, of course, occasional lapses into indulgence." But the Boston Cooking School Cookbook did not see the need for palatability or indulgence. Rombauer's self-published book soon found an audience beyond her immediate community. Beginners found its recipes simple and encouraging, and as a local society columnist remarked approvingly, "It does not insult my intelligence." An experienced housekeeper wrote Rombauer, "Your book has taught me to use my own brains because it encourages adapting and improvising with what you have on hand." Despite or because of its personal nature, it appealed to a wide readership. So new brides, career girls, men, women formerly reliant on household help, and the help themselves all took to it. Heartened by this success, Rombauer expanded it, adding recipes and commentary for the commercially published 1936 edition. She also introduced a new recipe format that she developed herself. And here you can see how it combines the precision of the scientific cookery method. She's giving you exact measurements for everything using the standardized measuring cups and spoons, but she's made it into a kind of a narrative so that although all the ingredients are set off in bold and indent, there's still kind of a narrative of what you do, and the ingredients are introduced in the order in which they're used. And she made that up, in between this edition and the next one. In the preface of this edition, she writes, "Encouragement has come from many sources, especially from the eloping bride who telegraphed her family, 'Am married. Order announcements. Send me a Rombauer cookbook at once. From the man who told her, at last I can eat spinach, which I think means thanks to the recipe for creamed spinach, and from an unknown Cincinnati maid who stole her mistress's copy of The Joy of Cooking. So she recognized that as flattering. While Joy's embrace of convenience foods makes it seem appealingly modern, it also pays tribute to her German-American heritage. The 1936 preface begins, "Although I have been modernized by life and by my children, my roots are Victorian. This book reflects my life." That is, it combines old and new in a way that home economics departments and domestic scientists might not fully appreciate, but that reflects how most of us cook and who most of us are. Rombauer's roots are represented by a wealth of recipes with such German names as Kartoffelklöße, Sauerbraten, Seifgürkchen, and she gives the German for these dishes too, as well as a translation. Sauerbraten is German beef à la mode. And desserts, especially German baked desserts, take up more than a third of her book. She includes recipes for several Torten, Stollen, Kugelhopf, apple strudel, or grandmother's apple cake, Kuchen, lots of Christmas cookies. And this section is perhaps the strongest of the book. And the robust dessert section also recognizes the interest in recreational cooking that was growing at this time. Baking for fun, and perhaps with children, was not a priority of the Boston Cooking School. But most cookbooks were concerned with getting dinner on the table rather than optional frills like dessert. While Rombauer is clearly knowledgeable about German dishes, other cultures don't always fare as well. And the two spaghetti recipes sound particularly grim. You've seen this. One of them calls for boiling the spaghetti for 20 minutes, combining it with white sauce, a can of tomato soup, half a pound of cheese, a pound of seafood, and then reheating it. It's a good make-ahead dish. Each successive edition incorporates more international cooking. The 36th edition adds goulash, jambalaya, sukiyaki, although it was spelled sakiyuki, Javanese rice taffel, and a Spanish casserole that calls for a can of tomato soup because she's not really hung up on authenticity. But even in the 1931 edition, Rombauer included dishes that represented her travels, such as risotto and chocolate eclairs, to appeal to more adventurous cooks. American regional food is represented by southern fried chicken, sweet potato pudding, and gumbo okra, all which would have been brought to St. Louis by African Americans during the Great Migration. The main reason for Joy's success, however, is that Rombauer's personality shines through the pages. She is good company, and if she were alive today, she would have a lot of followers on Twitter, I bet more than Martha Stewart. To appreciate the charms of The Joy of Cooking, it's useful to compare its opening to that of the Boston Cooking School cookbook. Here you go. The opening to Farmer's Tome sets the tone like so. Food is anything that nourishes the body, 13 elements enter into the composition of the body, yada, 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 yada. It's clear that this is going to be a very important and serious book that will probably give you a headache. In contrast, this is how Rombauer sets the tone, with cocktails and roosters. It's like, welcome to my party, welcome to my cookbook. And remember, 1931 is during Prohibition. So not only does she begin with drinks, but her very first recipe suggestion is to take plenty of gin and use your imagination. So the reader knows that she's in relaxed company. And the illustration is a cut paper silhouette by her daughter Marion, who later became the director of Cincinnati's Modern Art Society before taking over The Joy of Cooking from her mother. So she was very accomplished. While the Fanny Farmer tone is an exacting and prescriptive textbook, Rombauer is telling you to relax and improvise. And her casual culinary chat, which is part of the subtitle of The Joy of Cooking, includes lots of anecdotes and remembrances. So a recipe for cheese custard pie, for example, begins with a tribute to its originator, a vile-tempered Swiss cook named Marguerite. While she was certainly not born with a silver spoon in her mouth, though it was large enough to accommodate several, I am convinced that she arrived with a cooking spoon in her hand. So the reader gets a smile as well as a recipe. When Rombauer's publisher, Bobbs Merrill, suggested cutting back on the chat to save space in the 36th edition, Rombauer put her foot down with this telegram. So imagine all caps and no punctuation. Rather cut recipes than paragraph. Incentive to read book. Believe it or not, it has been considered literature, especially by men. Average cookbook, deadly monotonous, even for cooks. think this is distinguishing feature, important, widely praised, arouses curiosity. The caps always make it seem like you're shouting. I just want to call attention to this assertion of her cookbook as literature. And so these are some things that people have said about books, and so maybe take a look at them and think, how might this appeal to a well-loved cookbook? Can it carry over? So she hedges on the idea of it being literature by saying, believe it or not, and she attributes it to someone else, especially men, because men know what they're talking about, and also men are a potential, vast audience to tap for this book. She's telling the publisher, you want to, maybe get some of these male cookbook buyers. She is making a claim about her book being literature and her being a writer. And the culinary chat that sounds so trivial is in fact anything but. It invites the reader to actually read a cookbook and not just consult it as a reference book. Through such narrative elements, readers engage with the authorial voice as they would the narrator of a novel. And this involves putting yourself in the hands of the narrator rather than using the book in a utilitarian way to serve your own particular predetermined purpose. It creates a kind of openness on the part of the reader, a sense of trust. And this does two things. It helps create the sense of companionship that made the book so dear to so many readers. And as Rombauer says, it arouses curiosity. It encourages readers to be open-minded and perhaps try something new. So this promotes a different role for a cookbook than perhaps to prescribe behavior and enforce gender or class or ethnocentric norms. It puts the emphasis more on expansion than restriction. And even recipes themselves can be, which don't really seem like so much fun to read, can be thought of as tiny narratives, stories of pretend meals, as B. Wilson called them in The New Yorker, that we can enjoy much as an armchair traveler reads a good travel narrative. And also sometimes it's relaxing to read about other people doing work. Whether we desire nostalgia or novelty, a cookbook can oblige. And Rombauer wrote in the preface to her 1931 edition, "Now, after all, I am a writer of a kind." And now the Library of Congress has really confirmed that. Fortunately, Bob's Merrill heeded Rombauer's insistence upon keeping the chat. And much later, a selling point of the 75th anniversary edition in 2006 was that it restored the charming voice of the earlier editions. The 1936 edition includes more chapter introductions and headnotes, such as good enough for a company main dish, here is a homely dish that can be made quite thrilling, that's creamed onions and cheese on toast. The headnotes get extra enthusiastic in the baking section. So the cherry kuchen recipe is the pièce de résistance from a household famous for its good food. She wrote of a German cake, "This recipe must be starred as the nut cake my friends so frequently ask for." About a lemon meringue pie, she relates that a cousin was highly indignant when I failed to put this luxurious recipe in my first cookbook. I especially like when the comments get self-reflexive, calling attention to the fact that she's writing a cookbook, as when she writes that a meringue tart deserves all the asterisks in the printing press. And lastly, of a crumb spice cake, this really deserves mention of some kind, but I have run out of adjectives. So while often the commentary is a simple good or delicious, elsewhere her storytelling gets freer rein. To accompany the recipe for white cake 2 with lamb mold, which happens to have been my own childhood birthday cake, because I was born around Easter, Rombauer tells a story of a neighbor offering a hat pin to help keep the lamb's head from falling off, with imperfect results. The ungrateful husband said the joint work of art looks like an unknown grave in winter. Again, Rombauer as a writer. Cooking mishaps will happen, and here Rombauer sets an example by meeting them with humor. After all, it's just a cake. Don't set your self-esteem on it. In her book, Eat My Words, cookbook historian Janet Theophano writes, "As much recipes for living as formulas for cooking, cookbooks are forums for discussing the conduct of life." Rombauer's headnote for jam tarts, "It is a treat sometimes to stroll from paths with which one is contemptuously familiar," is an observation with wider application than just dessert. The fact that she clearly cooked what she liked and was a curious, lively, opinionated person encouraged readers to claim her as a guide, teacher, muse to become a cook in their own way. Note Edmund Wilson's words, "No two people ever read the same book." It's safe to assume that readers were finding different things in The Joy of Cooking depending on what they were looking for, and I think Rombauer really encouraged that. Of the following editions, I'll mention just two. The 1943 edition was the first that outsold the Boston Cooking School cookbook. It expanded to over twice the size of the 1931 original, so it was a more all-purpose general reference book, and it also incorporated the can opener recipes from a cookbook that Rombauer wrote in '39 called Streamline Cooking to appeal to working women. And it was also better organized than the previous editions. Anne Mendelsohn wrote in Stand Facing the Stove, the story of the women who gave America the joy of cooking, that starting with the 1943 edition, her sprightly, irreverent alternative to the kitchen Bibles was now a Bible. Rombauer said in its preface, "I now feel a close friendship with many thousands of persons. I hear from them constantly, and I am greeted as an old friend in the most unexpected of places." This World War II edition also won many letters of gratitude from American servicemen who found themselves in charge of a mess hall. The Joy of Cooking was recognized as a patriotic contribution to war morale, and this meant a great deal to Rombauer. Through The Joy of Cooking, she was able to claim and celebrate both sides of her German-American identity. That hyphen could make her proudly both German and American, rather than making her feel divided or marginalized, as she often did growing up in St. Louis. Just as she was both Victorian and modern, she could be of immigrant German heritage and fully American, even during the war. Her daughter, Marion Rombauer Becker, took a larger role in Joy after Rombauer suffered a series of strokes starting in 1955, and Marion's 1975 edition was the bestseller of them all. Julia Child said of the 1975 edition that if she could have just one cookbook, that would be it. And she had learned to cook from the 1943 edition and a subscription to Gourmet magazine, because they complement each other perfectly. Marion attempted to introduce her passions for organic gardening, sustainability, and healthy eating into Joy, starting with the 1951 edition. And by 1975, her once fringy interests looked downright mainstream. That edition, which included recipes for granola and tofu, as well as pot roast and mashed potatoes, found a place in kitchens everywhere from suburbia to communes. Marion's interest in health food helped the book continue to be relevant, even when a subculture of America defected from a country that could choose not only white flour over whole wheat, but Cool Whip over whipped cream, Tang over orange juice, and Bacon Bits over bacon. The ever-capacious Joy of Cooking encompasses all of it. So whether you saw the industrial food system as your liberator or your oppressor, you could find dinner ideas within its pages. So I have, So I'm going to skip the part on blogs in the interest of time, but I can come back and talk about it more if you're interested. So Irma Rombauer's Vanity Project, a cookbook that reflected her own quirks and the heritage of her immediate community, became not just her memoir, but ours as a country. As Mendelsohn writes in Stand Facing the Stove, the famous old cookbook, as I have come to know it, is patchy, accidental, inconsistent. That is just what is best about it. It records the sheer improbability of 20th century American cooking from the Great Depression to the Ford administration. A lawless melange of blueprints for progress, nostalgic hankerings, gourmet cults, time-saving expedients, media-inspired fads, and unexpected rebellions. Yes, it is sometimes incoherent and contradictory, and that is its strength, its charm, its truth. As Walt Whitman wrote in Leaves of Grass, do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes. Rombauer contained multitudes as well, so does her book, and so do all of us. We Americans might not have the coherent traditional cuisine of some countries, but what we have is perhaps better. The cuisine of the both and, the cuisine of a diverse geography and a diverse people, a nation of immigrants, whether recent or not. All right, thank you. So, comments or questions? Yes?
I have a question on something you mentioned with the editions from the 1930s. There was the idea that men were buying the cookbook, and I was curious what type of men would need a cookbook.
Well, I think maybe single men, you know, who didn't live with their mothers. I mean, there isn't, as far as I know, any data on how many men were actually buying the cookbook. And Rombauer was going just on the basis of people who like came up to her or wrote her fan mail and said, this was, you know, something I found really useful, thank you. And actually a friend of mine who received The Joy of Cooking as a shower gift, and it was a classic shower gift in the 50s. A lot of people were getting it. And so perhaps it was, you know, you could say, well, you know, great shower gift for Peggy. Peggy was 38 and was on her second career. Her first career was as a professional chef, and she got The Joy of Cooking as a shower gift from a woman who said, this book has been my friend in the kitchen for almost 50 years. I will be married 50 years this spring. You know, I want you to have a copy, and it has a series of ribbons through it where the woman who gave it to her has marked all the recipes that her family used and made little notations about it. So, like, we learned about Spätzle in Germany, good with meatballs, or this baked rice dish goes with everything. We use brown rice. And, you know, Peggy thought it was sweet, but the person, she already knows so much about cooking, but the person who really uses it in her house is her husband. So it's kind of turned out to be the bridal gift that was really the groom gift. So. Yes?
Could we go around and ask everybody what their favorite recipe is for I'm curious to hear.
Could we, yeah, if we could, well, how many of you have a favorite recipe from The Joy of Cooking? Does anyone who, okay, anyone who does, all right.
Boston cream pie.
Boston cream pie, okay. Chicken Marengo, okay. And who had their hand up in the back? Who had a favorite recipe? Yes.
There's a wonderful pasta asparagus salmon.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I couldn't. It's a pasta with asparagus and salmon and lemon sauce.
Okay.
And her directions for cooking turkey breast are
Okay.
big letters.
Okay. Good to know. Good to know. Well, thank you for those. Yes.
I always found this cookbook intimidating
Okay.
because, and you had one slide further back that sort of demonstrates what irritated me about it, which was, according to previous instructions, do this. It was the one on pumpkin pie, which there must have been something that says, yes, there it is.
Yeah.
Prepared by the preceding
Right.
rules. What preceding rules?
Right.
You'd have to go find the rules
Right.
before you could do the rest of it, as opposed to another style cookbook that assumed they needed to tell you everything in that recipe about
Right.
how to prepare the pumpkin, etc.
Yeah.
Am I being honest?
Oh, no. I mean, yeah. Did you guys want to, do either of you want to comment on that, or you're just agreeing? You want to add to that? Yeah.
That's how I learned to cook, was by flipping
By flipping through?
to find the other instructions. My dad had I think the 63 or the 75 edition. And, you know, it was big, and he was telling me, he just handed it to me, and I was like, oh, okay. So, yeah, I learned a lot by just flipping around.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I think it's really interesting too. Julia Child uses this same format in
Yes.
her mastering art of French cooking.
Yes.
Which I didn't find intimidating because I'd also learned to cook, kind of cook, before I started trying to do
Right.
Julia Child.
But the way her, at least the edition of her books that I have, the way they're laid out, they take up so much space, and I find them really aggravating because I'm always having to flip pages.
Right.
And this is tighter, at least you can,
Right.
they usually get it on the same page.
But yeah, I mean, the problem of how to organize a cookbook is just always there. And when everyone basically knew how to make a pastry and how to stew a pumpkin and all that, you didn't have to tell them. You didn't have to include it at all. But here, the recipe, either it refers to another recipe, like this one for pie crust, or it will refer to the instructions at the beginning of the whole section. So you have to page to that. And that's how they can get a level of detail in without having each recipe be so very long. And the Julia Child recipes are often incredibly long, and they have embedded recipes. And if you look at Carême's version, he'll have a recipe that's this long, because literally everyone knows how to make those sauces and perform those techniques. And in Julia Child, it will be 7 pages long and have 4 embedded recipes, because she has to tell you how to make every single part. Nothing is assumed about how to do it. So it's like, yeah, if everyone knows how to do it, you know, the recipes can be really compact and the cookbooks can be really short. But these, I mean, this is her original cookbook, but each cookbook has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, as it includes more international recipes, partly. It gets updated, more exotic guides to exotic fruits and vegetables, guides to grains. You know, there's so much more. And then now it's huge. And now they're working on having it online, but it's like it got so big, it's just sort of like, you know, and it's like the Encyclopedia Britannica turned into Wikipedia, you know, because you just can't continue to add pages. You know, it's because like the joy of cooking would be, you know, like this big, it would be a whole wall, you know, if you just kept adding and adding and adding. So like that's the wonderful thing about the internet, is that there's seemingly no space constraints. And you can click on a link and be right at that pie crust without having to, you know, turn the pages. But also that means that once you know how to make that pie crust, then you know that you can do all different kinds of things to it. So that's part of what Rombauer is teaching, how Rombauer is making you a cook instead of just someone who follows recipes, and how Julia Child was making you a cook, because once you had the techniques and knew how to do basic things, you could kind of mix and match and do stuff with them. Yes.
I was wondering about the latest edition of The Joy of Cooking, which, as I understand it, was written by a grandson.
Yes.
And I must say, I found it not as good as the 75. I mean, it gets too precise and precious, and I don't know, it's just more than I want in terms of a recipe. But I don't know how, if anybody else has experienced that with the latest edition. I made the mistake of buying 5 copies so that I could give it to my children, and they kind of think, yeah, Mom, really? You know?
Yeah.
Well, what are we going to use this for? So, I don't know. I just had to comment on that. I'd be curious if anyone else has found that too.
Didn't they
Yeah.
draw on a number of chefs for
They
individual
did.
recipes?
They did.
For that reason, I think it lacked that authorial voice. So wonderful in the earlier versions.
Yeah, if you want the authorial voice, the 75th anniversary edition includes more of the older recipes and tries to include more of the voice. And the most recent edition, it has really, you know, great people are tapped for their knowledge for the different sections. But then when you're looking at each section, it's like you don't know which of those recipes are from Deborah Madison or whatever. And again, as with the other versions, the recipes may come from all these different sources, people in her community and readers and all that, but you don't necessarily know who's from, like what other recipes are from this household, you know, famous for their cooking. So then I think it is kind of frustrating. But with the giants, I mean, the newest edition is the biggest one of all, and there is a trade-off between, you know, providing more detail and then having it all become like, you know, too much. Yeah, and I think it's just, I don't know. It's not a cookbook that I've used, so I don't really know. Yes.
Incorporate this book into any of your classes?
We did a section on cookbooks for my food and media class. We did not talk about this cookbook really. You know, we talked, or maybe just briefly, but we were reading something on the Betty Crocker picture cookbook. And so we were looking at this idea of the corporations at the time creating these spokeswomen to try to kind of soften the corporate image and make it seem personal. And Irma Rombauer was a person. So like she was the alternative to the people like Betty Crocker, but they all had them. They all had, you know, in their pamphlets and their cookbooks, all of them had these domestic science, fictional characters, so that when you wrote the home ec department, you could write, Dear Betty Crocker, and there was a whole staff of domestic scientists working at headquarters who were Betty Crocker and would sign that. And then, it's interesting really, because Betty Crocker was, to get her signature, they asked all the women working there to sign something, and then they tried to figure out which would be, the most Betty-like. And for the most, they kept changing the image of Betty Crocker over the years, and the most recent one is a computer-generated image. It took all these different women of different ethnicities and fed them all into the computer, and then out comes this woman who, she's of sort of indeterminate ethnicity, but she's sort of every woman. So I think it's really interesting how Irma Rombauer has this immense appeal because she is an individual, because she has this unique, inimitable voice that's very charming, but she doesn't tell you too much. Like, you don't have photos of her and her family and sort of confessional anecdotes about her life, really. Like, you hear about the cook Marguerite, but you don't get a lot of first-person stuff. That has become so common on, say, blogs today, where people provide, a lot of that sense of intimacy with the reader that Rombauer's creating with the cookbook, and a lot of people didn't really like that much. Like, maybe it was a little bit too chummy for them. They're kind of like cute, but I don't know. Maybe they like the Julia Child treating you like a professional a little bit more. But the bloggers are so interested in kind of cultivating their audience and cultivating that sense of friendship. And they can do it through the comment section, where people write in and they can write back. And then also they're posting regularly, so you can feel like, you have this ongoing relationship with them. But then if you look at bloggers, so many of them are variations on kind of the same kind of 25 to 30 upper middle class white woman, posting these sort of healthy foods and writing a lot about domesticity and family. And there's not an incredible variety. You don't see the variety among them that you would have had in the variety, from as far as I can tell, of the different people who bought and used The Joy of Cooking, who were from really a lot of different walks of life. And that's traditionally very common to cookbooks. You buy, the people who would have a cookbook, they might be middle class, they might be upper class, they might be employers, they might be the household help. There'd be all different people who would be using that cookbook. And that there's something about the fact that it has a voice, but not too much specificity about it. It enables you to kind of project a little bit or ignore the things that would make her different from you. And like sometimes, and it also, it keeps it from being kind of a domestic agenda, because it's like sometimes there's this, cookbooks have a kind of a gender agenda, which I don't really get that much from The Joy of Cooking, and you really don't get from Julia Child. Julia Child says very clearly, it's like, this is for the servantless cook, man or woman, anyone can do this. It's traditionally male work, actually, learning to do, to make these French food recipes. And so she's a little bit more focusing on the work. So I kind of appreciate the fact that she's leaving out a lot of the, on one hand, it's going back to this earlier kind of reform-based cookbook where there is this sort of taking you by the hand and being a guide for you. But on the other hand, it's not too personal in a way that's going to be excluding a reader, if that makes sense. It's sort of a nice, it's not as much, you don't get as much of the eye as you get in a lot of stuff that people are writing today. Yes?
I was wondering if in your research you've looked at the American Women's Cookbook, which must have been a rival for
Yes.
decades.
It was, and I haven't seen that particular cookbook myself, but I came across references to it as another cookbook that was basically by a committee, by a corporation, and that had it was very influential, but it didn't have necessarily the staying power of Joy of Cooking. And a lot of these other cookbooks that were by committee, they sold more copies than The Joy of Cooking. Better Homes and Gardens sold more copies. They were bigger. They did sell more. It's not as if the personal voice enabled her to sell more, but it's. I think that part of why it's important is because of the attachment that people have testified to have, regarding the book, and also its influence upon what's happened since, where the personality of the writer and having the book be a kind of a connection to a human being, to a personality, is something that we see today as well. But it wasn't the big, it sold a lot of copies, but it wasn't the biggest seller. Yes.
I just wanted to say that for your entire speech, I sat here with a smile on my face. Because is the joy of cooking. And then the other thing is the books, the joy of sex. I mean, we've got to give credit to this woman and her title for creating another industry.
Right. Right. Well, they probably would have had sex without the joy of cooking, but yes, it was a great model. And actually, I was trying to remember I don't know if you guys are familiar with the cookbook writer, the food writer John Thorne. He has this great saying about how cookbooks, unfortunately, they're less like the Kama Sutra and more like, like, I don't know, a technical manual or something, where he's saying cookbooks could be, this kind of, how to have all this pleasure. And yet so often they're a little bit more like the Boston Cooking School cookbook, although maybe in what would be for us an updated version of that. Wouldn't look exactly the same. It would have a little bit, more up-to-date packaging, but it would be looking at maybe, carbs and, gluten and, all of these things that have a basis in science, and then they just sort of get distorted and people are eating as if it's just fuel for the body and not part of culture and part of daily life and part of pleasure. So, it's so easy to laugh at the Boston Cooking School cookbook, but we have an updated version of that going on today, where it's like you have to eat in a certain way if you're going to, lose weight, live forever, not get cancer. This is what you have to do, and we're going to tell you, and you have to follow it, and it's going to require some restraint. But it's just changed its form. That kind of Puritan impulse is still strong in our culture. Yes.
The title seems to be inspired, and I just wondered, do you know anything about how Rombauer came to the title?
I don't know where she got it from, but it was really a surprising title, especially because she's naming this cookbook The Joy of Cooking so soon after her husband has committed suicide. And that it seems, I think Ann Mendelsohn, who wrote Stand Facing the Stove, which tells the story of Irma Rombauer and Marion Rombauer Becker and their children and their long saga of struggles with the publishing company. But she, I think, talks to people who speculated that it might have been part of her denial, like of her husband's suicide, of not wanting to kind of acknowledge the grief of that. It was not something that was really talked about much in the family after it happened, because it was just so painful. So I think part of it, who knows? She speculates that. I think part of it is to sell women on this work that they're going to be doing more of, because she was one of those households that was used to having household help, and she still had household help after the Depression, during the Depression and after the death of her husband, but she had less of it, so she had to do more, and she saw a lot of other people in the same condition. And so by calling this work, a joy, she was saying, like, buck up, ladies, keep your chin up. It's like, it's gonna be all right, So I think, and also, if maybe it's a good salesmanship, if people are like, oh, this cookbook looks more fun than this other cookbook, I'll buy that one. And it was the most fun cookbook going at the time, so that was not false advertising. Yes?
Well, you're just reminding me of another cookbook called the I Hate to Cook book.
Oh, yes.
Which was certainly a personality, and
Yes.
I loved it.
Yeah.
You don't have to take the title seriously to to use the cookbook and just enjoy the idea of getting
Right.
away with murder.
Right. And Peggy Bracken, reminds me a little bit of Irma Bombeck, who you know, sort of almost referred to there as someone who's a domestic humorist who just kind of, I remember that book being in the basement when I was growing up and sort of taking it off the shelf and trying to figure out what to make of it. And Irma Bombeck had references to the chenille bedspread impressions on her face from taking a nap in the middle of the afternoon. So when she came to the door, she'd have the sign that she'd been just taking a nap rather than working on dinner or her hair or whatever she was supposed to be doing according to the domestic mores of the time. Yes.
I would have thought that the joy would come from, would be escape. Because all you gotta do is come from this direction, and there's nothing else. And, no suicide, no petty troubles. You're just cooking. One of my problems with Rombauer is the options. And there's our
Oh, that's
pumpkin.
interesting.
Or use canned pumpkin.
Uh-huh.
What a great idea. May I share with you I don't know if the book has been translated. You'd have to go metric, I think, for
Oh, uh-huh.
But
I don't know that it has been.
I lived in Burma, and we had a Buddhist cook. He used the 43 edition of Joy of Cooking.
Wow.
Followed it to the letter because he didn't eat meat.
Mm-hmm.
That caused him to put too much salt in everything. Followed it to the letter, and the colonel in the office wanted a steak. This man could not cook a steak without killing it to death. Even though he was following a recipe, he just wouldn't, and the colonel told him how to do it, which may have been part of the problem. But he made the most wonderful dishes, except for the salt.
Except for the salt. Uh-huh. Well, it's interesting. A lot of people do cook and especially bake because they find it therapeutic to just follow a recipe and be, doing one thing after another, and you combine all these things and you get pie, and then you get to eat it. And one of my students brought cookies to class last Wednesday, and she said her mother was a single mother, and in good times or in bad, one thing that they would always do together was to bake cookies. So she said, this is our family tradition and that of a lot of others, and that it's something that's, that people can come back to, and it's comforting, and the precision and method of it has a value. I think sometimes we think improvisation and adaptation is always better. Freedom is always better. It's like sometimes you just need to measure a cup of sugar and, the pound of butter and just do what's on the page. And, but again, they're all different options here, depending on what you need.
Thank you very much for setting us up for the holidays.
Well, thank you. I'm so glad all of you could make it. And if you want to ask any questions afterwards, I'll be here. So thank you again.